I had always sought a fresh start. When the opportunity to move to my grandmother's small and isolated town arose, I seized it with the hope of leaving behind the shadows that had been haunting me. The house she left me was colossal and ancient, with an aura of mystery that seemed to pulse within the walls, as if the house itself were breathing. My first afternoon in the house was a mix of excitement and discomfort. The shadows of dusk stretched across the rooms, making the spaces even more somber. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing on the aged wooden floor. I moved cautiously, each step shrouded in a strange premonition, as if something invisible were watching me. When I finally reached the attic, the atmosphere changed drastically. The air was heavy and cold, and the afternoon light barely penetrated the gloom of the attic. Among the dusty clothing boxes and furniture covered in gray sheets, something in the darkest corner caught my attention. There was an old mirror, wrapped in a dark, worn cloth. The approach was almost involuntary. Curiosity mingled with an inexplicable fear. The cloth was filthy, with dark stains that seemed to have no origin. I yanked it off with a sudden motion, and the sound of the cloth dragging was like a mournful wail. The mirror revealed a polished surface, but the reflection was distorted, as if the glass itself had grown weary of reflecting and had begun to absorb something dark. The mirror seemed to absorb light in an almost organic manner. There was an almost palpable coldness to the glass's surface, a sense that it was not merely reflecting but drawing in the light and warmth from the surroundings. My eyes fixed on the surface, and I felt, with a shiver down my spine, that the reflection did not exactly match what I saw in the world around me. Shadows moved unsettlingly, and the angles of the mirror seemed to shift subtly, creating a feeling of distortion. I felt an irresistible force pulling me toward the mirror, as if it were trying to absorb me. The sensation was terrifying, as if the mirror were alive, breathing with a rhythm of its own. The edges of the mirror seemed to stretch and contract, distorting reality in a way I could barely comprehend. My mind spun with the idea of using the mirror in my therapy sessions. I found myself justifying it to myself. Perhaps it could help my patients confront their own deepest fears, perhaps I could find a purpose for that disturbing object. But in every moment of clarity, I felt a premonition that the mirror was more than it appeared, that it harbored dark secrets, and that I was about to open a door that would be better left closed. I decided to use the mirror during therapy sessions, a choice that seemed logical at the time despite the persistent unease I felt. The mirror was now in my office, leaning against the wall, its cold gleam contrasting with the warmth of the room. I positioned it so that it reflected the chair where my patients sat, thinking it might create a new dynamic in the sessions. In the first few days, there seemed to be a positive effect. My patients, with their stories of distress and anxiety, began to open up more, as if the mirror had the power to reveal hidden layers of their thoughts. But soon, something began to change. Reports of disturbing visions and inexplicable fears started to emerge. One of my patients, Amanda, a young student with severe anxiety, described a recurring nightmare involving a shadow that followed her. She said that during the sessions, the mirror seemed to amplify the shadow she saw in her dreams, reflecting it in a more vivid and threatening way. Her eyes were always wide with terror, and she trembled while speaking, something I had never seen before. Another patient, Daniel, started talking about a feeling of oppressive presence. He mentioned that, while speaking, he felt as if something was approaching him through the mirror's surface, something he couldn't describe clearly but that terrified him. He had begun to experience hallucinations during the day, with distorted figures appearing in the shadows. His behavior became erratic, and he started avoiding light, claiming that it interfered with the visions he saw in the mirror. The transformation of my patients was gradual but undeniable. They began to isolate themselves, their expressions grew increasingly disturbed, and their speech became less coherent. The office, once a space of healing, transformed into a place of growing despair. I watched my patients crumble before me, their minds deteriorating in ways I couldn't explain. I tried to maintain composure, but the mirror seemed to be rooted in something deeply disturbing. Its polished and pristine surfaces now appeared as a window to a darkness I couldn't see clearly, but that was affecting each of my patients. The idea that the mirror might be influencing their mental state left me uneasy, a sense that I was dealing with forces beyond my comprehension. With each session, the atmosphere grew denser, and I found myself questioning the normality of what was happening. The mental health of my patients was deteriorating in an inexplicable and frightening way. The mirror, which had seemed like a simple tool for exploring the human mind, was revealing something much darker and more disturbing, something I didn't know how to confront. As the days went by, I began to notice disturbing changes within myself. The mirror, which had seemed to have such an intense effect on my patients, was now starting to exert its influence over me in an equally insidious manner. My nights were consumed by nightmares, each one more horrifying and vivid than the last. In one particularly distressing dream, I found myself in a dark room, with the mirror before me, reflecting not only my own face but a distorted and grotesque version of myself. My reflection appeared to melt and contort, with hollow eyes and a crooked smile that I didn't recognize. Each movement of my reflection seemed to follow its own rhythm, and I felt a cold presence drawing nearer, as if the mirror itself were trying to swallow me. Hallucinations began to invade my reality. In the middle of the day, I would see shadowy figures moving in the wall shadows, always fleeting and evasive. The mirror reflected these visions with a cruel clarity. It was as if it amplified and distorted my deepest fears. A constant feeling of being watched hung over me, as if the mirror's very eyes were fixed on every movement I made. It was then that I started investigating the mirror's origin. In one of the few moments of clarity, I decided to search for information about its history. The truth I uncovered was even more disturbing than I had anticipated. The mirror didn't merely reflect reality, it revealed the darkest secrets of those who looked into it. Historically, there were accounts of people being consumed by it, their worst fears and guilt brought to the surface and amplified in cruel ways. I found myself growing increasingly suspicious and isolated. My patients were becoming more erratic, and now, I couldn't distinguish whether their behavior was a result of their own anxieties or the direct influence of the mirror. My new acquaintances in town also began to seem strange and evasive. I found myself questioning every interaction, every gesture, as if everyone around me were actors in a Machiavellian play. The loneliness was becoming overwhelming. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that everyone was hiding something. The mirror wasn't just affecting my patients, it was turning my own mind into a battleground of terror and paranoia. Every mirror I saw, in every store or house, seemed to mock my sanity, each reflection a reminder of the darkness I had awakened. I felt as if I were being pulled into an endless abyss, the line between reality and delirium dissolving day by day. I was struggling not only to maintain my sanity but also to understand what was truly happening, and with every attempt, the mirror seemed to smile at me, a promise of even more horrifying truths to come. The weight of doubt and fear consumed me more each day. The mirror seemed to have a disturbing influence on my mind, and I knew I needed to uncover more about its origin to try to understand what was happening. With my mind clouded by nightmares and hallucinations, I began to sift through the old files and objects I had found in my grandmother's house. It was on a dark afternoon, amidst ancient books and dusty documents, that I found something that made my blood run cold. I discovered a leather-bound diary, covered with a thin layer of dust, containing unsettling notes about the mirror. The diary revealed a macabre and twisted story, detailing not only the mirror's origin but also its role in ancient and obscure rituals. The pages were filled with frantic writing, interspersed with strange symbols and grotesque drawings. With each word I read, a sense of dread grew within me. The mirror was not merely a decorative object but a central piece of a ritual that my grandmother, an enigmatic and feared figure, used to invoke and manipulate supernatural forces. She believed the mirror was a portal, a means to access and control entities from beyond. The diary revealed that my grandmother had been involved with occult cults, practicing rituals that sought power and control through sacrifices and invocations. The mirror was described as a vehicle for communication with the abyss, used to reflect and manifest the deepest human fears and desires. This revelation made my heart race. I had inherited not just a house, but a legacy of darkness and malevolence. The connection between the mirror and my own sanity became painfully clear. What I was experiencing was not just an effect of the mirror on my patients, but a direct manifestation of my own fears and traumas. The disturbing visions and hallucinations were not mere coincidences, they were an extension of the forces my grandmother had conjured, preying on my internal weaknesses. Every buried fear, every unresolved trauma in my life seemed to be amplified by the mirror. The feeling of being watched, the terror of my nightmares, all were connected to something deeper and darker than I could have imagined. The mirror seemed to exploit every crack in my psyche, using them to manipulate me and plunge me into an endless nightmare. The internal struggle I was experiencing was more than just a mental battle, it was a fight against forces far beyond my comprehension. I was struggling to maintain control, but the weight of the truth revealed by the diary made the line between reality and illusion even thinner. Each moment spent in front of the mirror felt like a deeper descent into an abyss of personal despair and darkness. The decision to confront the mirror came in a moment of absolute desperation. I could no longer bear the growing sensation of being consumed by a darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Each step I took towards the mirror in my office felt like a step into the unknown, a deep plunge into an abyss I didn't fully understand. The night was particularly dark as I prepared for the final confrontation. The mirror reflected the dim light of the lamp as if it were absorbing every ray, making the environment even more oppressive. I felt a penetrating coldness as I approached, and the atmosphere itself seemed to pulsate with a palpable tension. I leaned against the mirror, and the reflected image was a nightmare in itself. My own reflection was distorted, with eyes that were not mine and a smile that seemed to mock me. The glass seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if it were alive. The sensation of being observed and analyzed by the mirror was overwhelming, as if I were being pulled into it. Then the visions began to intensify. I saw images of my own fears, materialized and amplified into grotesque forms. My deepest traumas, which I had buried under layers of denial, emerged in a whirlwind of horror. My parents, who had died in a tragic accident, appeared in the mirror, not as they were, but as distorted and twisted figures, crying and reaching out to me with expressions of pain. The line between reality and illusion completely disintegrated. The mirror began to speak, or at least, it seemed to speak. Voices whispered in a dissonant tone, mixing my own memories with murmurs of suffering I couldn't comprehend. The space around me became a cacophony of screams and whispers, and I found myself struggling to maintain my sanity as I was crushed under the weight of guilt and fear that the mirror had revealed. The climax of the confrontation was a psychological battle. I screamed at the mirror, demanding that it release me, that it stop torturing me with these visions. Each word seemed to reverberate through the glass, intensifying the distortions until the mirror itself began to look like a storm of warped reflections. At the peak of my desperation, I grabbed a hammer and, with a determined blow, attacked the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 fragments, each reflecting my own face in a multitude of grotesque forms. When the mirror was finally shattered, a wave of relief and exhaustion washed over me. But even as I watched the broken remains, I knew that the struggle was not entirely over. The trauma of the experience had left deep scars on my mind. What I had seen and experienced in that mirror would not easily disappear. The terror and pain would remain with me, a constant shadow in my future life. Destroying the mirror might have halted its direct influence, but the psychological impact it had on me was a wound that would likely never heal completely. Sanity, once lost, is hard to regain, and I knew that the future awaiting me would be marked by a persistent fear and a sense of mental fragility that could never be entirely overcome.